Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Today, I'm really excited to present a conversation with Ellen Levy on her new book, A Book About Ray, which I have right here. This brand new publication is the first ever full career survey of the enigmatic Black Mountain College student Ray Johnson, who was a collagist, performance artist, and pioneer of correspondence art. The book is at once an incredible introduction and also a truly deep dive into the life and times of this fascinating figure. And I feel so privileged to have read it before most of the rest of the world. Levy's other writings include her book Criminal Ingenuity, Moore, Cornell, Ashbery, and the Struggle Between the Arts, as well as essays and reviews on poetry, visual art, theater, and television. She has taught at the Pratt Institute, the School of Visual Arts, and at Vanderbilt University. Ellen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So I wanted to sort of start out talking about the project at large. So for anyone who is interested in Ray Johnson, they would know that this artist is notoriously hard to pin down in terms of movement and medium and even like chronology. So if you could tell us a little bit about how you approached this book project and your kind of process in researching Ray Johnson.
Well, as you've just indicated, it's a complicated and multi-directional story. The short of it is that I had seen the Ray Johnson documentary, How to Draw a Bunny, as a lot of people are introduced to him through this from the early 2000s. And I really liked it, but I had never seen the art. And so I kind of had a sense of him as a person. But then I saw a little bit later, in sort of around 2010, as I was finishing my first book, I saw a show at the then Richard Feigen Gallery, which at the time housed Ray Johnson's estate, and it was a big collage show. And the book I was doing was about Joseph Cornell, Marianne Moore, and John Ashbery. And there were a lot of collages that made reference to Cornell and Moore in really wonderful ways. And I thought, God, should this guy be in my book? And also, I just found the collages completely compelling. I had never seen anything like them. I thought they were beautiful and mysterious. And of course, he's very, very funny. And I love funny artists. I love artists who make me laugh. And I was laughing out loud and I was thinking, I don't know what this is about, and yet I think I know how this guy's mind works. And so I just started researching him a little, thinking maybe I'll write a coda to the book about him. And then I realized, oh God, there is a lot there, a lot, and this would take more than I could do. But I went to the estate and I did give a talk about him right around then, and that got turned into a little pamphlet catalog that they were doing. They were doing a series of these small catalogs. And so that went into that. But I had had a glimpse at the estate of the riches that were there. Because as people may know from the movie, Ray Johnson committed suicide and he died intestate. And his house was set up as a kind of installation and it was full of work. Of all his, I mean, except for the performance, although even the setup of the house was a kind of performance when they went in. And this is, again, you can see this in the film. And so there was an enormous amount at the estate. And I thought, I should do something. And then finally, around 2014, I decided I was going to ask the estate, because I knew they had the permissions for all things Ray Johnson, if they would agree to let me start researching a book. And I thought initially of a biography. And then I realized that what he really needed was an account of the art and the career, because as you said initially, he's an elusive person, but so are a lot of us. But what was killing me was the beauty of the art and the difficulty of describing it to people. I like difficulty in art. And I got more and more drawn in by the difficulty of telling people what kind of artist he was and why I was interested. And And I realized two things. One, you needed to sort of describe the total practice because I think it is a total practice. Some people talk about the mail, some people talk about the collages, very few people talk about the performance because that's the most elusive stuff. But nobody quite talked about it as one thing, and I think he conceived it as one thing. Everything connects to everything. He has a very connecty way of thinking. He's a metonymus thinker. One thing leads to another, to another, to another. And I wanted to convey that way of thinking, convey that when you're looking at one aspect of the practice, there's all this other stuff behind it. And to show, this is the second part, he was very eccentric. And people sometimes treat him as an outsider artist, that is, someone who did something that was instinctive and weird, but not art. But he was an art artist. He went to Black Mountain College. He went even to an arts high school. He was deeply trained in art history. He had a real sense of where he belonged in art history, both in terms of his contemporaries and deep art history. And he had a sense of of how his art was developing over time. And I wanted to do those two things, give a sense of the total practice and a sense of how the art developed over time. So it became what I call not a biography, although because life and art were very much found out for him, it involves the life, but a career history. Even though Ray Johnson did not have what most people would call a career. In terms of if what you think of career as is a kind of professional pursuit of fame and fortune. So I guess, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think if readers, of course, are interested, and once they pick up a copy of the book, I think you lay out so much of this so beautifully in just the first couple of pages. This real challenge of sort of summarizing Ray Johnson, but you've done such an amazing job of it, and it really is such an involved process through all of the different connections and networks involved throughout his life, which sort of brings me to my next question that I wanted to talk about, that I'm sure will greatly interest our audience here at Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center, which is the subject of Black Mountain College. So as you mentioned, Ray Johnson studied at Black Mountain College, and I wanted to sort of talk about the role of the college in his art story and in your book. So Ray was a student at Black Mountain College beginning in the summer of 1945 and remained at the college until the end of the summer of 1948. This is for our Black Mountain College nerds in the audience. The relationships that he formed at Black Mountain College were sort of foundational and followed him throughout all of his life. And his training there was foundational not only socially but artistically as well. And so I wanted to open up that question to you, Ellen, about how you see Black Mountain as a sort of central role in this sort of development of Ray Johnson as artist.
He never, ever, ever stopped thinking about Black Mountain. I'm going to give a talk at Black Mountain at your conference this year. And for that, I've been thinking about the way in which it returns and returns and returns to the very end of his life. And, it's people focus on, it's something I've thought about for this. It's people focus on the friendships he made at Black Mountain, centrally with people like Ruth Asawa and so on. And of course, his studying with Josef Albers, which is, as you say, found absolutely foundational, never goes away, pervades his practice. He never says, he stops being a painter in the mid-50s. He gives up painting and moves to these other modes, but he never stops thinking about what he learned from Albers, and the other practices that he engages in are influenced in very interesting ways by Albers. And then there's Cage, who's the other foundational teacher, even though Cage was only overlapped with him in the summer of 48. And this comes to the point I was just about to make, which is he met people at Black Mountain, and Albers for him was Black Mountain only. But it's as important to him in the years right after he leaves Black Mountain, the 10 years really, after he started in Black Mountain into the mid 50s. He comes to New York. So at Black Mountain during that summer of 48, there's Cage and Cunningham and the de Koonings. It was a really legendary summer. People who weren't actually part of the long-term faculty there were there, but people talk a lot about them because they were so influential from that summer. And then he falls in love with Richard Lippold, who was brought down there by John Cage, who was a close friend of his. And I want to remark, as you remarked, that we are looking at a beautiful Richard Lippold sculpture in beautiful shape above your head. So the sculptor Richard Lippold comes down there. He's older, much older, and married. And Ray Johnson is 20, and they fall in love. And Ray Johnson comes to New York to be with him. And in New York, there is this Black Mountain network. It's not just the people he knew. I mean, Asawa, for instance, goes off to California, and that friendship kind of fades after a couple of years. But there are people like Robert Rauschenberg and Norman Solomon and Dorothea Rockburn, and all these people come to New York. Nick Cernovich, all these people who become hugely influential in Ray Johnson's life come to New York, and Ray lives in a building with Cage, sometimes Cunningham, and Lippold, and also Morton Feldman, the composer. And this becomes, so the Black Mountain influence keeps happening for him. Cage becomes a sort of teacher mentor for him in this New York space, more than he was at Black Mountain, but he's connected to Black Mountain, and there are parties. And I mean, just Ray Johnson's art world begins with Black Mountain and expands through New York with Black Mountain, in ways that just those friendships never end, some of them. And he meets people like Bill Wilson, who was his other great archivist. He was his own archivist, and that archives at the estate, but there's this other major archive that is now at the Art Institute of Chicago that was kept by an English professor named William S. Wilson, who became friends with Ray in the mid-50s, and he became friends with Ray through Norman Solomon, who became friends with Ray through Hazel Archer. The connections just keep going.
I'll put up on the screen here there's this amazing image of Ray Johnson and Morton Feldman and John Cage and Richard Lippold in the hearse, in the back of the hearse,
which was the car that Richard Lippold drove, in part because you could put sculptures in the back. We had no SUVs back then. Yes, that picture comes from a Harper's Bazaar article, little squib, in which they talk about the wild bohemians living on the Lower East Side.
Totally. Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's super interesting to think about that, not only that first degree, right, Black Mountain College connections, but that second degree, and how all of this fuels Ray Johnson's connections to the art world. And something I really appreciate about your book is really foregrounding all of those different connections and all of the different cameos that we see from Black Mountain figures throughout the narrative, and this kind of idea that Ray Johnson himself is almost a historian or archivist of the art world. So that would be another question. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that impulse in the work and in the collages, this kind of historiographic element.
Well, he himself uses the word history a lot. There's a moment in his career when he starts saying in one piece and another, this is Ray Johnson's history of this, Ray Johnson's history of that, Ray Johnson's history of, there's a mailer that you have in the bunch I sent you that is Ray Johnson's history of Black Mountain College. Send for your free copy. Ray Johnson's history of the, this gallery or that gallery. He has realized that he's begun putting all these names in his art. And, there are all these lists that have to do with his performances. He had these things, there, on the one hand, there are these names that connect to his correspondence, because his correspondence art, as people may or may not know, was not just a question of sending something to someone, but were a kind of proto social media where chain letters were sent around a network and became altered and went in different directions and connected friends, but also connected strangers to friends. And this network grew and grew and grew to thousands of people. And it did grow out from the core of this network as Black Mountain people, really, or people he met through Black Mountain. And so there are these names that come through correspondence. Then in the late 60s and 68, he starts holding these things called meetings that are just, he'd get a room and he'd invite all these people he knew, most of whom were on the correspondence network, and they would just sort of appear. And everyone I talked to about them, I'd say, "What happened? What were they like?" And said they were like nothing. They were like cocktail parties without drinks or snacks. And we didn't know why we were here, but sometimes things would happen. They were kind of instantiation of the network. Just imagine if you could push a button and your Instagram network would appear in a room. What would happen? That's the idea. So he started doing these mailers that had all these names on them of the people, and they would have drawings and they would have jokes, and of the people that he was inviting, also sort of fantasy people he would invite, if they would come. And so he would send out these mailers with names that had these chart-like qualities, and then the charts started making their way into the art and into the exhibition art, that is to say, the collages. And that's when he started thinking, I am recording in these networks a history of the art world of my day. And then he started making charts that also had real historical kind of structures to them. There are a lot of charts at a certain point about the figures in Paris in the 20s, for instance, mostly female figures. So he thinks I am a kind of historian, sociologist of connections, of the way in which the art world is a network. And network theory is growing at this point. He's friends with Lawrence Alloway, the art historian who talked the most early on about networks and the art world. So this is, this becomes physically instantiated in the art.
Yeah, I find that so interesting. And something else related to that subject, I have to say that in the book you do such an amazing job, Ellen, of sort of picking out the most salient quotations from Ray Johnson himself, because in so many interviews it is so very difficult to decipher what exactly he's talking about. And so something that you really have developed such a knack for is really distilling the important bites of information from that, and making it make sense with this broader career survey that we're looking at. And so in this vein, I find it very interesting that at one point he starts referring to this whole idea of the correspondence art and of the mailings as the correspondence situation. And so I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit. I hadn't really encountered this idea in the literature before, this idea that he was rather frustrated with the nebulousness of the correspondence school as is. And so of course that leads into some of these other projects, like the charts, and then later we can talk about the silhouette project as well. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the correspondence situation.
He first uses that phrase in 64, which is just a couple years after the New York correspondent. Somebody, this guy suggested he should call. So he's been sending this stuff around since the mid 50s, right? And at first it is just correspondence and then traded among friends. But then he begins to realize it's a thing. And in 62, this guy suggests that he call it the New York Correspondence School, which is a joke about, on the one hand, the New York School, which is what some people called abstract expressionism, and on the other hand, correspondence. There used to be these correspondence schools where you could write in and send drawings, and people would teach you how to become an artist by mail. A little bit of a scam, but it was in magazines and comic books. You could write away for these correspondence school art courses. So that's what that was. But so in '64, he kind of he had stopped painting in '58. This is a 6-year time frame. He decided he had already started doing collage and correspondence by '58, and in '58 he just said, "Oh, I'm not a painter. I'm something else." And so he started focusing on this other stuff. But by '64, he realized that if you're going to send out mail every day, all day, it is a fairly absorbing and overwhelming situation. There's that word. And you're not getting your art out into the wider world. And he kind of looks up and says, "What am I doing? Why am I doing this? I'm finding this very absorbing. It seems to be the thing I should be doing. And it's feeding into other work. But what is this that I am doing?" And this is actually when he starts connecting with Lawrence Alloway. But so when he first calls it a situation, that's on the way to calling it a practice. I mean, he never calls it a practice. He never uses theoretical language. He hates theoretical language. But it's he realizes that there's a theory behind it, that there is a meaning to it, and he has to find a way to make that clear to other people who are not members of the network necessarily. I mean, of course, everyone he got near became a member of the network because they started receiving mail from Ray Johnson. But he wanted to make it clear to curators and to people in the art world that this is not just some wacky personal thing with me and my friends. This is an art thing. And it becomes a bigger art thing. Obviously, correspondence art starts spreading to other people at this point. So yeah, that's when the situation thing, and then of course it starts overwhelming him in other ways when he develops these enormous fan bases and strangers are writing to him every day, and he tries to respond to everything while having more of an art life in other ways. So it has that situation problem too. But I think that the initial use of that word comes from a kind of waking up to what he's doing.
One I guess, final subject I wanted to touch on in terms of all these themes that you cover in the book, and this sort of dynamism between the art world and the art as life, and the negligible separation between these two, is this project that Ray Johnson comes to later in his career, which is the Silhouette University Project, which I'm very interested in, and in many ways synergizes a lot of these previous concerns that he's having. So this idea of networkedness, and of historicizing the art world, and of friendships over time, but also of performance. So I really love in the book how you describe the silhouettes themselves as a performative action when they're traced, and this sort of intimacy and electricity in the moment of the creation, and then of course they're worked into the collages. So I would love if you could tell me and our audience a little bit about your thinking on the silhouettes, and that sort of aspect.
Well, can I turn this back on you for a second? Because I know you've written about the silhouettes. And can you say a little bit about why why you were drawn to this particular. First, describe what they are, and and um, and well, okay, I'll tell you the little background story, and then I'm going to turn this question on you. Why
Perfect.
the silhouettes? So the silhouettes were the art curator, and she's an artist and a gallerist, Holly Solomon, sent Ray a little silhouette she had cut of herself, silhouette, these cut paper portraits of your profile. She had it done at Disneyland because, in one of the old timey, I think probably on the Main Street bit in Disneyland, they did a silhouette because this was the 19th century. Well, it starts earlier, but done a lot. And so she gave him the silhouette, and he thought, oh, so cool. That's so great. I want to do that. And the Holly Solomon silhouette actually appears in a lot of the silhouette pieces. But he starts going to people's houses or galleries or whatever, and goes with his friend Toby Spieselman, who he met through Ray Johnson, who he met through Bill Wilson, who he met through Norman Solomon, who he met through Hazel Larson Archer. So Toby Spieselman goes with him, and she holds a light, and he pins a piece of paper to the wall, and the person stands there in profile, and he traces their profile, just a kind of notational drawing. And then he made hundreds of these of all kinds of people. And then he started working them into collages and mailings. And often he sort of superimposes two profiles on one another, sort of connecting two people at once in a collage. Okay, that's what they are. So why were you why is was that part of Ray Johnson the thing that really grabbed you?
That's a great question, Ellen. So I would say something, the thing that initially really grabbed me about Ray Johnson, I came to learn about this artist through Black Mountain College, of course, through a geographic connection because I was here in Asheville and I learned about Black Mountain College because of that. And what immediately really just struck me was the combination of the artist's hand and these hand drawn, hand designed graphic elements amidst these found materials and these more abstract, you call them like the tesserae in the book, things like this. And that was very interesting to me. I have always thought of myself as someone who really appreciates that hand and as a cartoonist and as an illustrator at various points of life. And so, yeah, I was just fascinated by that. And the silhouettes for me were so interestingly emblematic of that because they are so, they're not a found object. They are very intimately a type of portraiture. They are actually hand drawn. They are traced from life, so they're like a still life as well as like a portraiture all at once. So interesting, and yet in the collages they become like this slate. Like they just become another element within this found environment. And so I found in general it very fascinating how he combined these found elements and like sort of what we would call pop elements with these iconographic elements, and then the silhouettes for me were like this sort of massive whole of like they take up such enormous swaths of so many of the collages, and if you don't know who is depicted in the silhouette, you feel like you're missing. There's like a hole in the meaning of the work for you, and so then you have to go and find that out. Which of course is a similar experience when you're looking at the seating charts or something. You're like, oh, I want to learn what all these names are, but it's a little different when
Because
you
it's
have.
much more abstract. You have the name, you can look it up.
Exactly. And with the silhouette, and especially because typically in, a seating chart, we'll get like, 20 odd names on a page. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not doing all that. I'm not Googling every single name on this list if I don't know who they are. But with the silhouettes, usually you've just got two nestled inside each other and then maybe a couple other names floating around the work. And so those people really start to have a presence through the work. And I found it such an evocative sort of synthesis. Once I had studied the artist a little more, I found the silhouette such a fascinating synthesis of all of his other concerns. And the fact that I feel like I haven't seen them silhouettes as a concept present within much art of that period within the mid-century because yeah, I mean they are, but uh, not super prominently. So that was also very fascinating to me.
As you were talking, I mean, of course, they're an old medium, and he's interested in old media. He's
Hmm.
interested in the way people love to say, "Oh, he's Mr. Internet, Mr. Social Media, he's Mr. Future," and that's true. But he's also completely aware that all media will pass. He's very interested in that thing, and that's thematic in the work. And that's a thing he loves about the silhouettes because they were a form of portraiture that went out with photography. One of the many things photography made obsolete.
Hmm.
So there's that. But as you're talking, I was thinking, this is something that fascinates me about Ray Johnson. And one reason I decided not to write a biography, and one reason I made the rule in my book, as I say, that if it's not in the art, it's not in the book. I know things about him personally that are not in the book. And I think that's how he thinks, but it's also that he's a people person of a very strange and major kind, but he does nothing in a certain way but portraits, that each name is a portrait, each bunny head is a portrait, and quite certainly for the first time ever with the silhouettes, and I think this is part of what you were saying about the fascination, it's a real physical portrait. It's a trace of the person, and you can, once you find out who it's a silhouette of, you think, oh yeah, I kind of recognize them. Although we look different in silhouette than we do to ourselves. One doesn't recognize one's own silhouette necessarily. But they're portraits that are not likenesses. They're likenesses that are not likenesses. He never does portraits that are likenesses, ever, ever, ever. His work is all about people, and in some sense, it's all portraits. And he often calls, once he enters that history of phase, he begins saying that his work is portraiture over and over. But you will never see a likeness of a face except the found likenesses. Sometimes photographs, including often photographs of him in the work. But you will never see him making a likeness of someone, something he could do, something he was perfectly capable of doing. But he didn't do, and that's because he thought people were more mysterious than that, more porous, more porous to one another. That what we call identity is endlessly, endlessly mobile and malleable. And that to insist that I am this person who is this thing is a lie about what people are. And he also, and to do that, he had to become anti-autobiographical in certain ways, even though he's all over his art, even though his life is all over his art, even though he gave those million interviews, which Julie Thompson, who is part of your Asheville network, did a beautiful book of. Even so, he doesn't want what we would usually call a portrait or a life story to be part of the art, because he thinks people are interesting in other ways.
Well, I think that is an absolutely beautiful note to end this conversation on. Thank you, Ellen, so much. I feel like we could just go on and on.
Well, I look forward to talking more about him with you in Asheville.
Absolutely. So I want to say for all of our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. This was a real treat. And we hope that you will pick up a copy of the book. Here it is. You can get a copy of this online from our store. You can also get it in person at our museum bookstore or wherever you get your books. So please pick up a copy because it is really just an incredible piece of work. Yeah, I think that's all of the announcements that I have. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you, and thank you so much for sharing this space with me.
Welcome. This was fun.